I have a friend who I will call Red, whose family has partial ownership of a cabin up in rural Upper Peninsula, Michigan. It's along the coast of Lake Superior where you can just barely see the land to the north across the water, if your vision's good. A few miles east is Ojibwe land, but at the cabin and some distance to the west and south, there's not much at all. The cabin, like its neighbors for several miles both ways along the road, was on a beach, which, as the years came and went, would be eroded onto and then come back. Sometimes it was just a sand coast. Sometimes it was a beach you could actually take a walk on. There are a few springs with quicksand bubbling in them, and an island nature preserve in the distance, which Red says is covered in poison ivy and bird shit. My phone doesn't get data up there, so in order to update my family on how I'm doing, I would have to rely on a Wi Fi hotspot from Red's mom's phone, since their carrier actually had coverage, if only barely. If the mom walked the 30-foot slope down the rickety wooden stairs to the beach, renovated each year and still never quite new, her coverage cut out completely. This was the second time I went to the cabin, after going up once the previous year. I'm allergic to pretty much everything that grows in soil or touches the sun. There are more mosquitoes in that place than there are grains of sand on the beach. I swear over the course of this 1 year's trip, I killed at least 15 of them just by clapping them between my hands, excluding by other methods. And considering the utter unwalkability of the region, it is the true image of a car dependent society. There was not much to engage with aside from the nature, but ultimately the nature was what I had come there for, as well as, of course, for my friend. Red's family is, suffice it to say, a bit annoying. It was just me, Red, and Red's parents, but the parents had enough irritating qualities for all the rest of us and a few guests, especially the father. But that was made worth it by the experience of simply being up there. The previous year, our week long stay had been a bizarrely transcendent experience for me. I had had deep, emotional, memorable conversations with my friend, up late at night, unable to sleep, as we both often are. I had experienced an admiration of the experience of simply existing that was rare for me, which, to be fair, I was aware even at the time was partially attributable to a prolonged manic episode. A few more qualities of the trip were brought about by coincidence, but ultimately I had a good time traveling up there and didn't regret my stay. I wasn't expecting a heavenly recreation of all my previous feelings upon going up there the second time, but I predicted it would be worthwhile. I don't regret going the second time, not really. I don't think I want to go again, though. One of the most obvious factors in the decreased wonder of my second experience is that it was a second experience. There wasn't much new about the cabin. There were new sights to be seen and things I simply hadn't yet experienced. We walked through more of the beach than the previous year. I took the opportunity to look around in the woods more. I was less fearful of doing things out of the eyes of other people, but overall, it was no longer my first time taking in these sights. Another factor is that my OCD had gotten significantly worse between trips. In fact, I had only had the awareness to start questioning whether it was OCD because it got worse. Monk and other such popular media depictions seem to portray OCD as an ability rather than a disability, but as someone who has it, I can tell you it is not enabling in the slightest. I obsessively tracked each object that I had taken out of the 3 bags that I had brought with me on the trip, and let me tell you, that sure might seem like it helped me not lose anything, but I hadn't left anything behind on the previous trip either when my disorder hadn't gotten nearly as pronounced. The cabin itself is probably some sort of timeshare. I'm not really sure what the arrangements are, and considering it's not an affair with which I actually have to worry myself, I don't care about asking. It's approximately 2 floors tall, though its internal layout is a little bit more accurately described as one floor with an open air loft. Behind it, though not physically continuous with the structure, is the aforementioned staircase down to the beach, which takes many turns and has many malproportioned landings. The cabin is very obviously not built to code, and the most obvious evidence of this is just the loft. The bottom floor is fairly standard. It's clearly not built by some large company working on a new suburbia, but all of it works just fine. Creaks generally no more than a house should. The ants which turn up dead on the carpet every time we return to visit never manage to eat through too many of the supports for the structure to stay standing. But the loft is really a specimen, and mostly due to one thing, which is the way you get up there. The cabin's foundation size is not very large. Were it only one floor, it would feel more like a somewhat accommodating motel room than a proper cabin, and the loft sits on top of roughly half of that foundation space. The half it doesn't sit on is entirely devoted to being the living room, covered by one big carpet aside from a kitchen off to the side. There's a fireplace in this living room right next to what has ended up being the entrance to the loft. But evidently, the original plan was for that fireplace to be absent, and for there to be stairs winding along that wall to get up to the loft. The idea of a fireplace was too tempting, so that ended up being what they went with. So, as for how to get up to the loft, they were left with two options. And trust me, I've not gone on about all this for nothing. The first option was to have a fairly even, accommodating staircase which stretched all the way to the opposite wall of the living room, effectively bisecting the already modestly sized space into two walk in closets. Or there was the other option, the one they ended up taking, which was to build a bizarre mutated hybrid between a staircase and a ladder. And now, this wasn't really the only option, as is clear upon further reflection. They could have built an actual ladder with rungs instead of a strange steps. On a sloped ladder, like the one leading up to the bunk bed I have at home, the rungs would be about half as wide as a step on a staircase and about one third as long sagittally, more like bars than platforms. They could have a flat top, depending on the chosen layout. This is not how the loft staircase was built. The staircase was clearly trying to be a proper staircase, though it had the proportions of a ladder. As a result, one was left with a hellish contraption where I could not put my legs far enough forward so that I could put my entire foot on one step, because there was not enough room for my calf to go there. So I had to stand with my heel hanging off backward, but my toe firmly resting on the step, which was a position that constantly seemed to jeer at me with the potential of falling off about as gracefully as Tony Collette. Due to the aforementioned small size of the living room, all of our bags were stored up in the loft, which resulted in me carrying a massive suitcase with my right hand, walking sideways up the steps, holding onto the wooden support beams on the sides of the stairs with my left hand, occasionally having to take said hand off and then clasp it back around the next beam to my left in order to make it up. And I moved the suitcase up that way and then down again at the end of the trip. The first night we were up there, or rather the first day, I fell asleep at 4 p.m. and was woken up 3 hours later for dinner. I hadn't slept 1 minute the previous night at my friend's house, nor for more than a few hours during the car ride up to our cabin, so once in the cabin, I had been sleeping up in the loft, which is where the designated beds for us were, which it turns out was just 1 foot below a roof that was insulated well enough to keep out rain, but not well enough to keep in heat. I ate dinner wearing a rain jacket as well as a cotton hoodie, and yet I was still shivering the whole time. The second day or so we were there, Red's dad came in one day to announce that he had found a desiccated dead raccoon under the shed's porch. Red and I both proposed at the same time, let's steal the bones. Don't look at me like that, we're both non binary. As one might expect from the description of desiccated, the raccoon was dried up and seemingly hard as a rock, completely rigid in its disturbingly twisted around death pose, and pretty much impossible to cut into like that. The thing I was most interested in, though, was the head, and I planned to start there, since not only was it going to presumably be the most interesting part to explore, but, well, there was already some flesh missing, so my work was cut out for me. It didn't appear that it had been eaten away, though, and in fact, it wasn't missing at all. Flesh had been physically peeled away from the mandible of the poor creature, oddly enough, only on one side. There were no eyes. There were some maggots inside, I quickly discovered, most of them small, some of them slightly bigger, and there were some in other areas of the body as well, including between the fur and skin of the tail. The tail was remarkably intact, though, and remarkably not rigid, or at least not as much as the rest of the body was. And the fur on specifically the tail was pretty intact as well, though I did find that it was very easy to free by use of the knife or by simply pulling off with my gloved fingers. So the tail and head ended up being my chosen points of entry, at least for now, as the trunk of the body was hard as a rock, as were the limbs, rigidly stuck in their positions. However, I did observe that the limbs were bent in odd ways, almost like empty doll skins, unstuffed. That at the base of the tail, from which I had stripped all the fur, there was a strange contortion of the skin in ways almost like you'd see in a topology textbook. That the skin connecting the head to the neck was twisted and gnarled. Eventually, I realized that no matter where I started, I wouldn't really get any sort of in without hydrating the specimen, so at that point, a few of the privileges I had previously been afforded were now gone. The desiccation had prevented the little critter from letting off much smell, but now that it was rehydrated, flies started coming. And in addition to the flies attempting to eat the dead animal, there were mosquitoes attempting to eat me. I initially had the intention of starting at the head and or the tail, then locating the rest of the vertebral column. It became evident rather quickly, however, that that would not be happening. I realized at some point that the head was connected to the rest of the body only by folded over flaps of skin and connective tissues. It was as if the lip was melted to the shoulder. I didn't fully think over what this might have meant before, having severed the head from the body, moving back to the abdomen and beginning to examine. It wasn't just that the spine was disconnected from the head. There was no spine. Perhaps there were vertebrae still in the tail, but I hadn't cut deep enough to find out, and that was no longer a concern of mine at the time. I eventually managed to find a decent hole where I could make a cut to begin to actually examine the inside of the body. My cut started near the base of the tail. Something I didn't fully describe earlier is how near the neck and the tail there were places where the skin appeared to be twisted around so that fur was hidden inside a pocket of flesh. I didn't worry about it at the time. The creature looked like it had died a painful death. I wasn't about to question a little contortion of its skin. I was questioning it now. I was worrying about it now. The fucking raccoon was inside out. I don't know how to explain this in a way that makes it really make sense, or rather, that explains what that even means, what the raccoon looked like when I say it was inside out. The skin, I had noticed since the beginning, looked dry, bare, and it had no fur. There was fur on the tail, exorbitantly much as you expect from a raccoon, and then at the base of the tail, it just stopped. There appeared to be roughly no fur on the head. And do you want to know where all of that fur went? Well, it was on what had initially appeared to be the inside of the raccoon. I cut the body open, and on the inside was all of the expected fur, apparently insulated from the elements by that skin, which was almost completely intact, both in its composition, still being thick and relatively rigid, and in its structure having almost no holes that I didn't personally make. Now, listen, this was not the first dead raccoon I've played with. The two I had experience with before this were roadkill. And one of those was more intact than the other, its abdomen ripped open and intestines splayed out on the road. And that's how I know that the intestines were simply absent from this dried out third specimen. They would be unmissable if they were there. But gone also were the heart, lungs, and any other viscera you can name. There didn't even appear to be any smaller arteries or veins remaining loosely in the cavity, which I suppose makes sense considering how the entire body of the animal had been everted. And I mentioned how the limbs were shriveled, wrapped up tightly against the body like limp puppets. Well, one of those raccoons on the road near my home, the other one, was painted on the asphalt. The only recognizable thing that remained of it was its paw. One singular paw. And I can't honestly tell you if the bones I was seeing were the ulna and radius or the tibia and fibula, but do you want to know what I can 100 fucking percent guarantee you? That those bones were noticeable. Those things are not like eel ribs. They do not simply disappear when you're not looking carefully for them. I saw them attached to that little paw, those little fingers and claws, like it was reaching for someone to pull it out of the hell in which its flattened body, imprinted upon by goddamn tire marks, seemed to be trapped. There were almost certainly no claws in those limbs, and definitely no bones, and do you want to know what else? The fucking limbs had been turned inside out too. The inside of the skin now on the exterior, and honestly, now that I think about it, I can't guarantee that I know where the claws went. For all I know, they could have been on the inside of the skin, still attached, but the ribs, they were gone, as were the vertebrae. Aside from its head, the only thing that wouldn't simply be easy to turn inside out like a dirty sock, the thing had been reduced to a skin. I could not, if you fucking paid me, figure out a way to accomplish what had been done to that raccoon. Especially not as cleanly and precisely as was done to it. I mean, fucking, like I said, the only perforations in the body were possibly one by the neck and one by the tail, which was so small that I could barely fit the tip alone of the blade into it in order to widen the hole and see more inside. I can at least think of ways to partially do that to the raccoon's eviscerated hide, involving lots of pushing and pulling and turning away to retch, but I could not think of a way to actually make it so that all of the skin's exterior pointed inside. And though the head and tail looked nearly intact, do remember that there was flesh peeled off the mandible, and there was a strange perforated fold in the skin near the base of the tail, which I have to believe the force had come through. And might I mention, when I explained this to someone, his incredulous response was that he imagined the flesh of the raccoon had been pulled out through the mouth. Though that is a heavily unpleasant visual, one I don't much like to picture, it would at least partially explain how this could have been done, but the maw was almost completely undisturbed. The jaws were open and the throat was not everted. So how could all of that fit out of this poor thing's body? The scapulae, the pelvis, they were gone too, and I can't imagine how they escaped. Seeing as our intent had been to keep the bones, and it didn't appear that there were any bones to find in the raccoon's body, save for some vertebrae the size of a fish's in the tail, we simply discarded the body back to where it belonged, the woods, as far away from the cabin as I could conveniently throw it. It pathetically wrapped itself around a thin tree. So now the head was all that was left. The periosteum was surprisingly easy to peel off parts of the cranium. The gums were a little bit fun to flay off the mandibles. After a while working on it, it became clear that the remaining meat, mostly cartilage or small pieces of tissues connected to bone markings, would have to be weakened in order to be taken apart. So it was boiled in a coffee can on the grill for a while and sat in the water overnight. When I took it out, many of the teeth had fallen out due to the fibrous joints being boiled away. Before Red's dad would allow me to boil it on the grill, I had to make sure to remove the brain. I quickly found the foramen magna and stuck my knife in. There was no brain at all. Washing my hands was an obsessive and paranoid process. I consistently had to wash the filth off in the kitchen sink, which is arguably not a great place to be exposing to that, but the bathroom was separated from the rest of the house by a door that you really had to bully into actually shutting, no matter how sure you were that it was already closed. It wasn't quite like the type of door in my home, which swells up in the summer so that it hardly fits into the frames. This bathroom door was more like a door you'd find in a school or office, except you had to absolutely insist upon pushing it into its frame for the latch on the door to actually find the hole in the frame where it was meant to insert. And the sink in there was tiny, and so was all the soap. Some final playing around with the knife finally cleaned the remaining flesh off the skull. I left it in a little plastic box for my friend's family to tend to since they would have more convenient places to actually store it. After a while, on the last day there before we left, Red and I finished watching a show. In order to start processing it, I had to go outside and scream, which everyone was prepared for since I told them all that was what I was going to be doing. But it turned out that I screamed with such fervor that the mom had mistaken my voice for Red's and thought that something horrible had happened, like one of us falling on the rocks. Apparently, I wasn't close enough to the water for that horrible scream to be inaudible from the cabin. After a while standing out there talking about the show as well as a bunch of other random bullshit, we went inside to continue talking. We were just tired of standing. I chose to sit on the floor most of the time while we kept on chatting inside, while Red sat on the couch. I was telling a story about some womanizing asshole from my high school when I heard two metered knocks on the door we had come in through not 30 minutes earlier. My head jerked in the direction. I looked back at Red, and they asked me, "So you heard that too?" The problem with there just having been two knocks at the door was first of all that it was around 0 dark 30. Both of Red's parents were asleep, and it probably would have been advisable for us to be as well. Another problem was that both of the doors into the cabin, which both connected to the living room, had screens outside of them to guard against the aforementioned mosquitoes and other various pests. But there was that sound, if not coming from the door, then coming from the wall next to it. One of the nicest things about the cabin was that it had a great view of the water. As I've mentioned, the beach is right there next to it, accessible just by walking down some nearby stairs, and the stairs themselves are so close to the water that the bottom step was almost always wet from splashing. And the most striking view of the water was from the massive windows covering almost the entire width of the northward facing wall of the cabin. No matter the time of day, you could look out from those windows and see the light dazzling on the water, except during the night when the sky was so dark that the view was black. Those windows on that wall were black rectangles reflecting back only the light from the inside of the house. The pine branches reaching toward those windows just feet away were completely invisible. The angle wasn't right to see any stars in the sky. There was simply nothing out there. I looked toward the door where the knock seemed to have come from after rising from the floor slowly. I looked at the doorknob and the lock. It appeared, at least visually from across the room, to be a little bit less firmly closed than it probably should have been, especially considering how I carefully pushed it shut when we came in. It wasn't quite as bad as the bathroom door, but it too had a bit of a pressure issue which prevented it from reliably closing without being bullied a little. I approached the door with my legs extended out in front of my body like I was walking toward a furious tiger. Red, from behind me, said, "Don't you fucking touch that door." And I decided to heed that advice considering just how wrong everything about this felt. The wind was blowing harder than it ever had up there. The waves were crashing louder than they ever had up there. The only thing that I know for sure is that the knocking sound I heard was not the screen door opening and shutting, and I know this because the door has a distinctive sound whenever it does so. A sound that I was able to compare and contrast when I heard it several more times during the night, mixed in with the wind and various sounds of knocking against random parts of the house, on the first floor, on the second floor, against blank walls, but strangely never against windows. The screen doors are indeed quite a nuisance with how loudly they open and close. They have string suspensions at their tops, and whenever they close hard, slamming forcefully against the wooden frame, just like they did that night in what I hope was the wind. Neither of them has any sort of mechanism to slow them down as they shut on their own, like the screen door at home does. And in fact, lots of things in that house are loud. The ladder stairs you go up to reach the loft creak like hell, as does the loft's floor, as does the hallway by which you reach the bathroom, which is right next to the bedroom where Red's parents remained asleep throughout all of this. The view from the cabin, at least, was lovely. At all hours of the day, you could hear the waves, and you could see the water, even from the loft, even from the very back of the loft. In the bathroom, in the kitchen, whether or not the light was on, the view from outside the windows was a true black that I rarely ever witnessed. Most of the nights, there were bugs desperately trying to get in, some of them so big that you could hear them slam into the glass as they reeled back and then flew at full force. I wonder if any of them ever died that way. There were none tonight, or at least not as many. The next morning, as we prepared to leave, I felt both nauseated and constipated. I had been undereating the entire trip, both due to the innate difficulty of sticking to routines while in explicitly non routine situations, like a trip away from home, but also due to the fact that any morsel eaten felt like an intrusion. I constantly felt like eating my fill was an indulgence. I know it's irrational. I knew that in the moment too, but as I took the 10-hour car ride home, both needing to shit and needing to eat at the same time, there wasn't much I could do about that except drink and eat the Gatorade and trail mix they'd packed in the car. I had fear of intruding on other people's sleep. I constantly had the feeling of the first person to wake up during a sleepover when it's not a good time to wake up anyone else and there's nothing to do when you feel completely alienated from your surroundings. Every step was a punch to the stomach as I worried about not waking Red parents or alerting whatever might have been outside to my presence. I grabbed a BB gun off the wall above one of the beds in the loft, and for the following hour, I took not one step without it in my hand. It's not even as if it was loaded. I'm not even quite sure if the damn thing worked, but if someone came in uninvited, perhaps they'd be less prone to doing whatever they thought they were going to do if I had it pointed at them. Or if it was something that wouldn't be afraid of a gun, perhaps I could use it as a blunt weapon. I've never shot anyone. I've never shot at anyone. I've never shot a gun. I've never even touched a real one. The closest I've ever come was that BB gun, as well as a few more in drawers downstairs at the cabin. On the first day of our trip, just as we were getting up to where the cabin was, we found that the driveway to the cabin was blocked by a car. There were several cars additionally in the paved driveway of the house directly to the east of ours. Red's parents pulled up to that house and asked whose vehicle it was. It turned out to just be a sad old man attending a quaint party with some of his friends, which was going on at the house that day. As we pulled into the driveway of our cabin, once the obstruction had been removed, I was busy putting a knife back in my bag, the same one I later used to strip the bones, which I had taken out in preparation for if this ended up being an unsavory encounter. I ended up going home having not needed to defend myself, except for against stink and bugs. I wonder if it's a good idea that my friend still has that raccoon skull in their home.